The first mechanic quit sometime around 4 in the morning. Nobody saw him leave. They only found the coffee cup sitting beside the diagnostic laptop, cold steam still hanging inside the cracked foam lid, while rain clouds rolled low over the western cornfields. The workshop lights buzzed weakly against the darkness. Outside, the wind moved through the dead stalks like whispering paper. Inside the shed, the tractor sat motionless, huge, silent, covered in 40 years of grease, dust, and faded Oliver green paint. A 1958 Oliver 88 row crop machine with cream wheel rims stained brown from old harvest mud, rust curling around the exhaust stack, and engine panels scarred from decades of hard seasons. 3 men had already spent nearly $80,000 trying to start it, and it still wouldn't turn over. Not once. Not even a cough. The grandson stood near the open barn doors, watching lightning flicker somewhere beyond the empty grain silos. Eli Mercer folded his arms tighter against the cold. 32 years old. 5 years gone from the farm. 2 months back. And already drowning. The bank wanted payment before winter. The soybean contract was collapsing. Half the combines were dead. And the only tractor capable of pulling the old emergency grain wagon through the lower mud fields was the Oliver. If the storm hit before harvest ended, the entire south acreage would flood. Again. The mechanics knew it. The consultants knew it. The bank representative knew it. Nobody said it out loud anymore. But everyone inside that workshop understood the same thing. If the Oliver didn't start, the farm was finished. A sharp metallic clang echoed from beneath the tractor. One of the dealership technicians slid out from underneath the engine housing covered in oil and frustration. "She's locked," he muttered. Another mechanic shook his head while scrolling through scanner readings on a tablet. "That makes no sense. Compression's there. Not enough. It should still crank. It's not the starter. We already replaced the starter. Then it's electrical. It's not electrical." The argument started again. Voices bouncing through the old shed. Cold breath hanging in the air. Expensive tools scattered across concrete floors stained black with half a century of machinery leaks. The grandson stared at the tractor. Something about it felt heavier than metal. Like it was listening. Like it knew they were failing. One of the consultants snapped his toolbox shut. "We should stop wasting money on this thing." Nobody answered. The wind groaned through the barn walls. Outside, a loose tin panel slammed against an abandoned silo. The technician wiped grease from his beard. "How long's it been sitting?" Eli looked toward the back of the workshop, toward the dark corner where old fuel cans and cracked leather belts hung from rusty nails. 8 years, he said quietly. The room went still. 8? Eli nodded. "Hasn't moved since my father died." Another silence. Not awkward. Heavy. The kind rural people learn to carry without speaking. One mechanic exhaled slowly. "Well, there's your answer." But even he didn't sound convinced, because deep down, every man in that room understood something strange. Machines that sat that long usually looked dead. This one didn't. The Oliver looked patient, like it was waiting. Thunder rolled somewhere across the county, and then the workshop door creaked open. Nobody noticed at first. Only the cold air drifting inside. Then the sound of slow boots against concrete. Grandpa Mercer stepped into the light without saying a word. Old canvas coat, worn gloves, gray stubble along his jaw. Eyes darker than the storm outside. He moved slowly now. Age had bent his shoulders and stiffened his knees, but there was something steady about him. Something unshaken. The older mechanic glanced up immediately. Recognition. Respect. The kind small towns never fully lose. "Evening, Walter." Grandpa nodded once. Nothing more. His eyes moved past the men, past the computers, past the piles of replaced parts worth thousands of dollars, and settled on the tractor. Silence filled the workshop again, not because anyone told it to, because somehow, without speaking, the old man had taken control of the room. Eli watched his grandfather remove his gloves carefully. The old farmer walked toward the Oliver with slow, deliberate steps, then rested, one weathered hand against the faded green hood. And for the first time all night, the old man spoke. What'd she do before she died? Nobody answered immediately, because somehow the question sounded wrong. Not technical, personal. Like he wasn't talking about machinery at all. Eli swallowed. She just stopped during harvest. Grandpa nodded slowly. When? October. What kind of rain? The mechanics exchanged confused looks. Eli frowned. What? What kind of rain? Lightning flashed beyond the workshop windows. Eli thought for a moment. Cold rain, he said. 3-day storm. Grandpa's fingers moved slightly along the hood, almost like memory. Then he looked at the starter housing, the fuel line, the flywheel casing, tiny details nobody else had noticed, and the old man became very still. Outside, the storm finally started moving toward the farm. By sunrise the next morning, the whole property smelled like wet dirt and diesel. Fog rolled low across the fields behind the farmhouse. The dead corn leaned sideways under the wind, and somewhere beyond the distant tree line, thunder kept circling closer. The Oliver remained silent in the workshop, but now the entire farm felt tied to it, as if the machine itself had become the center of everyone's fear. Eli stood on the porch, drinking burnt coffee, while bank trucks crawled slowly up the muddy driveway. Men in clean jackets stepped out carrying folders, notepads, numbers, forecasts, things that looked completely unnatural against the old farm. The bank representative introduced himself twice, because Grandpa ignored him both times. Walter Mercer sat in a wooden chair near the barn entrance, sharpening an old pocket knife against a whetstone. Slow, steady, like none of this was urgent. The banker tried smiling. We're just here to evaluate operational risk. Grandpa kept sharpening. The sound scraped softly through the cold air. Shh, shh, shh. The banker cleared his throat. We understand the Oliver is essential for lower field extraction. Grandpa looked up once. You ever pull flooded grain with a front wheel assist? The banker blinked. No. Then you don't understand much. Silence. Eli closed his eyes briefly. Same as always. His grandfather never raised his voice, never argued, but somehow still made grown men feel small. The banker adjusted his tie uncomfortably. We're trying to help. Grandpa returned to sharpening the knife. No, he said quietly. You're trying to count what's left. The banker didn't answer after that, because the old man was right. Everyone knew it. The farm had been shrinking for years. First the north acreage, then 2 silos sold off, then equipment auctions, then medical bills, then drought, then Eli's father dying in the middle of harvest season beside the irrigation ditch 20 yards from the lower field. Heart attack, 49 years old, collapsed face first into the mud, while rain swallowed the farm around him. After that, nothing ever felt alive here again, especially the Oliver. Eli remembered the exact day the tractor stopped. His father had been driving it. 3 weeks before he died, the engine suddenly locked in the middle of a flooded soybean lane. No explosion, no dramatic failure. It simply stopped, like something inside it chose silence. After the funeral, nobody touched it again. Not Grandpa, not Eli, not anyone. The tractor became something else after that. Part machine, part grave marker. And now, 8 years later, it was somehow their last chance. By noon, more experts arrived. a diesel engineer from Des Moines, 2 dealership technicians from Cedar Rapids, another independent mechanic who specialized in vintage agricultural engines. They brought scanners, compression kits, voltage readers, fuel pressure gauges, laptop diagnostics, and confidence for about an hour. Then confusion returned. The engineer wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cold. This thing should crank. It doesn't. I know that. Well? The engineer stared at the engine. It makes no sense. Grandpa sat silently near the tool bench listening, watching. His eyes moved constantly, noticing everything. A mechanic removed the starter again. Another checked battery loads. One man insisted the ignition timing had slipped. Another argued internal corrosion. Someone suggested complete engine seizure. The dealership technician finally stood up frustrated. We're chasing ghosts. Grandpa spoke without looking up. No, he said softly. You're chasing symptoms. The room quieted again. The engineer crossed his arms. You think you know something we don't? Grandpa continued sharpening the knife. No! Then what are we missing? The old man finally looked at him. What did the engine sound like before it stopped? The engineer frowned. That was 8 years ago. Grandpa nodded slightly. Exactly. Then he returned to silence. And somehow, that answer unsettled everyone, more than an argument would have. Late that evening, Eli found Grandpa alone behind the workshop. The old man stood beside a rusted fuel barrel, watching rain clouds gather over the empty fields. The wind tugged gently at his coat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eli finally asked the question sitting inside him all week. Why do you care so much about that tractor? Grandpa didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. When your grandmother got sick, he said quietly. We were already losing the farm. Eli stayed silent. The bank took most of the cattle that winter. A pause. Couldn't afford another tractor. The old man's voice carried no self-pity, just memory. Your father was 12. Another long silence drifted between them. Then Grandpa nodded toward the workshop. That Oliver saved us. The rain began tapping softly against the tin roof nearby. Grandpa continued. Bought her wrecked from a farmer outside Boone County. Transmission blown. Starter cracked clean through. Eli listened carefully. I rebuilt that tractor one piece at a time. You rebuilt all of it? Grandpa nodded. 3 winters. The grandson glanced toward the workshop lights glowing dimly through the rain. Dad used to talk about that tractor like it was family. Grandpa's face changed slightly, barely noticeable, but there. He learned to drive on it. The old man swallowed once, then looked away. That machine pulled every harvest we ever survived. The storm wind moved across the fields in low, cold waves. You know why your father loved it? Eli shook his head. Because the Oliver never quit during storms. A silence followed that sentence. Heavy, meaningful. Then Grandpa finally added, until the year he died. The grandson looked toward him slowly, but Grandpa had already turned away. Conversation over. That was his way. Always. Feelings arrived in fragments around Walter Mercer. Never speeches. Never emotional confessions. Just pieces people had to carry themselves. Inside the workshop, the mechanics were still arguing. Voices sharp now. Exhausted. One technician believed the flywheel teeth had fused from rust. Another insisted the engine timing had catastrophically shifted. The consultant wanted permission to scrap the tractor entirely. We're burning money. Eli entered the workshop just in time to hear Grandpa's quiet response. You boys ever harvest knee-deep mud before GPS existed? Nobody answered. The old man stepped slowly toward the Oliver, ran his fingers lightly beneath the flywheel housing. Then he crouched carefully, despite the pain in his knees. Listening. Actually listening. Not to diagnostics. To the machine itself. The younger mechanics exchanged awkward glances. One whispered quietly, "What's he hearing?" The older dealership technician answered, without taking his eyes off Grandpa. "Probably something we missed." That answer lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. The storm hit hard after midnight. Rain hammered the barn roof like thrown gravel. Wind pushed against the workshop walls hard enough to make the lights flicker. Mud swallowed the lower driveway. And still, the Oliver would not start. The engineers were exhausted now. Shirts stained black. Eyes bloodshot. Thousands of dollars in replaced components lay scattered across tables. New starter, new solenoid, rebuilt fuel pump, fresh battery arrays, wiring harnesses, sensors, switches. Nothing worked. The tractor remained dead. Eli sat against the wall watching rain stream down the workshop windows. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward Grandpa. The old man hadn't left the tractor once. Not really. Even when silent, he stayed near it, watching, remembering, waiting. Then suddenly Grandpa spoke. Quiet enough. Everyone almost missed it. She stalled before she died. The lead engineer looked up. "What?" Grandpa rested a hand against the hood. She didn't fail. The room fell silent. "She stalled." The engineer frowned. "That doesn't matter." Grandpa looked at him carefully. "Matters plenty." The younger mechanic sighed tiredly. "With respect, sir, we've checked every major system on this tractor." Grandpa nodded slowly. "I know. Then what exactly are you saying?" The old man became very still, then asked, "When did you boys last inspect the Bendix?" Silence. The mechanics looked at one another. One finally answered, "The starter drive?" Grandpa nodded once. "We replaced it." "No," Grandpa said softly. "You replaced the starter." The room changed, subtly, like air pressure before lightning. The engineer frowned harder now. "The Bendix engages automatically. Usually." Another silence. Grandpa's eyes moved toward the tractor again. She stalled during floodwater. Nobody spoke. The rain outside intensified. Thunder shook the windows. Then the old man finally said the sentence that made every mechanic in the room stop breathing for half a second. Flywheels stuck half a tooth out of seat. Silence. Absolute silence. The engineer stared. "That's impossible." Grandpa looked at him calmly. "No," he said. "Just rare." The younger technician shook his head immediately. "If the flywheel jammed the Bendix, we'd hear grind." Grandpa nodded slightly. "You would have. 8 years ago." The room froze. Because suddenly, it made sense. Not fully, but enough. The engineer moved quickly toward the housing. "Open it!" Tools clattered. Flashlights clicked on. The workshop exploded into motion again. Rain pounding outside, metal scraping, bolts hitting concrete. And through it all, Grandpa remained completely calm, like he already knew what they'd find. 20 minutes later, the younger technician slowly leaned backward from beneath the tractor. His face, pale. "Well, I'll be damned." The engineer crawled under beside him. Then silence again. Long silence. Finally, the engineer slid back out slowly. "How?" Nobody answered. Because nobody in that room understood how a man nearly 80 years old diagnosed a microscopic mechanical bind by memory alone. Except Grandpa, and he wasn't explaining yet. The engineer stood slowly. Even if that's the problem. He hesitated. The gears pressure locked. Another mechanic nodded grimly. "We'd need rotational release. And the crank won't turn. Not under that bind." The room sank again, hope collapsing almost instantly. Then Grandpa looked toward the old wooden tool chest beside the wall. "Get me the short-handled hammer." Nobody moved. The grandson stared at him. The hammer? Grandpa nodded once. Ball peen. The mechanic whispered quietly, "You serious?" Grandpa's eyes never left the tractor. Very. The rain thundered across the roof. Lights flickered. And somewhere far out in the darkness beyond the fields, a lone train horn echoed through the storm. The workshop became unnaturally quiet. No arguing. No diagnostics. No movement except rainwater dripping from jackets onto concrete floors. Eli handed Grandpa the old hammer carefully. The tool looked ancient. Handle worn smooth from decades of use. Steel darkened from oil and time. Grandpa weighed it once in his hand. Not dramatically, just familiar. Like muscle memory returning home. The younger mechanics watched skeptically. The engineer looked exhausted, more than doubtful now. Walter Mercer stepped slowly toward the Oliver. Every sound inside the workshop suddenly felt louder. The creak of his boots. The wind outside. The ticking metal of cooling tools. Even breathing. Dust floated through the dim yellow workshop lights. Rain shadows moved across the walls. Grandpa crouched beside the flywheel housing with visible pain in his knees. Then he became perfectly still. Listening again, his fingers rested lightly against the casing, feeling, measuring, remembering. Eli realized then something that unsettled him deeply. His grandfather knew this tractor better than he knew people. Not mechanically, personally. The old man closed his eyes for one brief second. Then positioned the hammer. One precise spot. No hesitation. The engineer leaned forward unconsciously. Grandpa spoke softly without looking up. "She's been trying to start this whole time." Then, clang. One strike. Sharp. Controlled. Metal rang. Through the workshop. Silence followed. Half a heartbeat. Then another. Nothing happened. The younger mechanic exhaled, disappointed. But Grandpa slowly stood, handed the hammer back to Eli, and nodded toward the ignition. Try her now. Nobody moved at first. Even the storm outside seemed quieter somehow. Then the engineer gestured weakly. Go ahead. Eli stepped toward the seat, heart pounding harder than it should. The leather cracked beneath him, his hand wrapped around the ignition lever. For one strange second, he remembered being 8 years old watching his father drive this exact machine through golden October fields. The same smell, the same cold metal, the same silence before ignition. Eli swallowed hard, then turned the key. At first, nothing. Then suddenly, clunk! A violent mechanical shift exploded beneath the housing. The entire tractor jolted. One piston rolled. Then another. The starter screamed, and the Oliver roared to life. The sound hit the workshop like thunder. Deep, violent, ancient. Black smoke blasted upward from the exhaust stack. The whole machine shook against the concrete floor like something waking from burial. Men stumbled backward instinctively. The engine growled louder. Oil smoke filled the workshop. The lights trembled overhead. And Eli sat frozen behind the wheel, while tears burned unexpectedly behind his eyes. The tractor was alive. Actually, alive. After 8 years. After $80,000. After every expert failed. The engine settled into a deep, uneven idle that sounded less like machinery, and more like breathing. Nobody spoke. Not one person. The mechanic stared in stunned disbelief. The engineer removed his glasses slowly. Rain hammered outside. Inside the workshop, the Oliver continued rumbling like distant earth moving beneath the farm. Then finally, the younger mechanic whispered the only thing anyone could think to ask. "How the hell did you know?" Grandpa looked at the tractor. Not proud, not smug, just tired. "She flooded during the storm 8 years ago," he said quietly. The room listened carefully. The starter tried engaging while the flywheel was slipping under load. He pointed gently toward the housing. Gear tooth jammed halfway into bind position. The engineer nodded slowly now, realizing it. The Bendix stayed locked. Grandpa nodded. Corrosion held it there. But diagnostics never caught it. They wouldn't. The old man rested one hand against the hood. You boys kept testing systems. A pause. She needed movement. Silence again. Then Grandpa added softly, sometimes machinery ain't broken. He looked around the workshop. It's just stuck remembering the last bad thing that happened to it. Nobody laughed, because somehow that sentence didn't feel like it was about the tractor anymore. The rain finally eased near dawn. Fog drifted low through the fields while the Oliver idled outside the workshop beneath pale gray skies. Its exhaust rose slowly into the cold morning air. Alive. After all those years. The mechanics had mostly stopped talking. Not from embarrassment. From reverence. Even the engineer stood quietly beside the machine now, studying it differently, like he finally understood he'd been looking at equations, while Grandpa had been looking at history. Eli found Walter sitting alone near the edge of the property, beside the old irrigation ditch, the same ditch where Eli's father died. The old man stared toward the lower fields where fog rolled over the soybeans. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Eli finally asked, "Why didn't you try fixing it before now?" Grandpa's eyes stayed on the fields. "Couldn't. You knew what was wrong." "No," Grandpa said quietly. "I knew where the hurt started." The grandson frowned slightly. Grandpa took a slow breath. "Your father was driving when she stalled." Wind moved softly through the dead corn nearby. He kept trying to restart it in the floodwater. Another silence. He thought if he could save harvest, he could save the farm. Eli looked down. He blamed himself after it died. Grandpa nodded once. And after he passed, the old man's voice grew thinner. I couldn't bring myself to hear that engine again. That truth settled heavily between them. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just painfully human. The tractor hadn't only stopped because of a mechanical bind. It stopped because grief settled over the farm like weather, and nobody knew how to move it again. Grandpa finally looked toward Eli. You know the real reason that tractor matters? The grandson shook his head. Walter pointed toward the fields. When your grandmother got sick, your father was going to quit school to help me keep this place. Eli frowned. He never told me that. Didn't want you knowing. A pause. That tractor let us finish harvest early enough to save the farm that winter. The old man swallowed carefully. Bought your father another year before adulthood swallowed him whole. The wind carried distant thunder far beyond the county now, moving away. Grandpa's eyes glistened slightly, though his face never changed. Every man's got one machine he loved too much. Then, after a long silence, that Oliver carried my family longer than I did. Eli looked toward the tractor idling near the barn. Smoke drifting upward into the pale morning. Old, scarred, still standing. Just like Grandpa. For the first time in years, the farm no longer felt dead. Not healed, not safe, but alive enough to fight again. Workers slowly emerged from the workshop carrying tools. The engineer approached carefully. Mr. Mercer? Grandpa looked up. The younger man hesitated, then extended his hand. Respectfully, not professionally. Walter shook it once. The engineer glanced toward the Oliver. I've worked engines 22 years, he admitted quietly. I've never seen anything like that. Grandpa nodded. You probably will again, someday. The engineer smiled faintly. How? The old farmer looked toward the fields. By getting old. The morning light slowly spread across the dying farmland. over empty silos, over rusted barns, over muddy harvest roads, over generations of loss buried beneath Midwestern soil. And through it all, the Oliver continued rumbling steadily beside the workshop, like an old heart refusing to quit, like memory itself refusing burial. By afternoon, the tractor rolled back into the lower fields for the first time in 8 years. Its massive rear tires crushed wet earth beneath them. The engine echoed across the farmland like something ancient returning home. Neighbors stopped along roadside fences just to watch it move. Some removed their hats. Others simply stared silently. Because in towns like this, people understood what survival looked like. And sometimes, it sounded exactly like an old tractor roaring back to life before the storm passed.